Watching the Tournament of Roses parade has been an American tradition to ring in the new year since its humble beginnings in the early 1900s. The City of Glendale has a long tradition of participation in the parade, starting in 1911 and second only to the City of Los Angeles. This is the story of a century of roses.
This parade is the granddaddy of them all when it comes to parades. And it is what they call America's New Year's celebration.
When I was growing up in Glendale, I watched the Rose Parade.
I've been a resident of Glendale for over 50 years, and I have a lot of pride in our city. And I think looking at the Rose Float every year, the processes and the people involved, and then seeing the ultimate float going down Colorado Boulevard really brings a lot of pride, both for me and for other residents, to see what our city can accomplish.
We get international coverage. The City of Glendale has a tradition of excellent floats, of beautiful floats. We are one of the most award-winning communities, even though we are actually very modest in our budget.
I've always loved the Glendale Rose Float. I love the Rose Parade in general. As a kid, we were one of the first people on the block to have a TV. To get up early in the morning and watch the Rose Parade was a treat for the whole family.
It's seen all over the world. You have 1 to 3 million spectators on the parade route, depending upon the parade. You have upwards of 100 to 300 million people who view this parade on television all over the world.
And for City of Glendale, who has been in the parade for 98 years now, second longest in parade history, 1 year behind Los Angeles, here's a chance to get a great deal of publicity and to get the home talent working on it and building that sense of community, I think is great.
We get a lot of publicity and we get a lot of exposure with that float. And if you think of all the people that watch the TV and the parade all over the world, that's how people get to see what Glendale is all about.
During its 100-year history in the Tournament of Roses, Glendale's floats have depicted local landmarks and icons, special events, animals, architecture, and even well-known characters. But there has always been one constant. Regardless of whether these floats won a trophy for the city, they have always been a source of pride for Glendale, uniting the community in one common cause.
The first Glendale float was in 1911, and it featured a replica of the Glendale High School. It was the first example of a city landmark being used in a float design. In 1920, this reproduction of a California bungalow earned the city a first prize of $100 and a trophy cup.
I remember a float that dates back to the 1920s, and it was a float design that depicted Glendale's growth over a period of time. At that time, Glendale was a young, growing city, and they were very proud to show that their population had increased significantly.
A trend began with the 1920 float that lasted for more than 2 decades. It involved a city employee named L.W. Chobe, and he created the float designs for the next 10 years. In 1923, he originated a peacock theme, and that brought in the city's first sweepstakes.
Glendale has a character that very much is a float of elegance. Peacocks were a theme and have continued to be a theme that Glendale has picked up on, peacock being one of the symbols of Glendale.
This peacock had a tail that extended 52 feet.
The one I would like to have seen was in 1923, the very first year of the Rose Bowl, when we had the peacock and we were the very first sweepstakes winner. And that was a big blue peacock.
The peacock float was so popular that the city immediately incorporated it into a new flag design and, after that, into the city's seal. You can still see that same image on neighborhood signs that are dotted throughout the city today. Just look for the signs bearing the 1923 peacock.
During the 1920s and early 30s, a wide variety of float themes rolled down Colorado Boulevard.
In 1924, the Fairyland float featured young children, and they were dressed as fairies and brownies. Other themes included a giant butterfly in 1925 and the popular elephant design in 1926. In 1928's Chinese Dragon was a real big crowd pleaser. It was a full 85 feet long, it swished its tail from side to side, it turned its head, and it rolled its eyes. This effort brought in both a first prize and a sweepstakes and brought national attention to Glendale. Mr. Chobe died in early 1930, and that was shortly after his float about the gold rush earned the city a first theme prize.
Chobe's wife took on the role of designer in the 1930s, and her 1932 effort, Germany, Nation of Flowers, took the Sweepstakes Award. Her design, featuring the Olympics, which would be held in Germany in 1936, attracted the attention of Albert Einstein, who with his wife made a personal visit to view the float.
By 1938, the Tournament of Roses parade was being broadcast into homes throughout the country. And that year, Georgia Chobe's design of the Seasons won another first prize for Glendale. The 50th anniversary of the Tournament of Roses parade occurred in 1939, and Glendale honored the parade theme of Golden Memories with its own float that was called Garden of Memories. And that float had elements of all the various themes that the Chobes had used throughout the years. The Junior Chamber of Commerce sponsored a float contest in 1941, and the first prize was a design of Abraham Lincoln as the Great Emancipator. This float earned a sweepstakes.
1941's float was to be the last for several years. War was declared after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. Army decreed there would be no parade and no football game in Pasadena, as the West Coast was deemed vulnerable to attack.
When the war ended in 1945, the Tournament of Roses announced the return of the parade. However, it was so late in the year that a lot of cities and a lot of organizations had to scramble to produce a float. And Glendale's residents and their civic organizations rose to the task. They produced a giant V for Victory float. And this float won a first prize in Class A on New Year's Day, 1946.
The city's tradition of producing award-winning floats continued throughout the late 40s and into the early 50s. In 1952, Girl of My Dreams won first prize for a spectacular violin design. Floats during this era were constructed by C. Lewis Stanley, who claimed he had been building floats since the horse and buggy days.
The theme of Madame Butterfly brought the city another sweepstakes in 1953. The float featured a young girl wearing a costume, and the costume was originally designed for a stage production of Puccini's opera. The cost of Glendale's floats had gradually been increasing over the years, and this year's effort came in at $6,000. 1954's float was a real crowd favorite. It featured Peter Pan and the Darling Children. Also on the float were two mermaids, and they were portrayed by the Queen of the Days of Verdugo parade and one of her princesses.
Glendale continued its winning streak with Easter Parade in 1956, bringing in a Class A first prize for the float, the design of which was a composite of several entries by Glendale students. Another first prize winner was 1958's Hawaiian Paradise, on which Hilo Hattie, a Hawaiian TV personality, and other Hawaiian musicians played, sang, and danced.
In 1959, a new designer came on the scene. His name was Sam Coleman. He was a dentist, and he was the son of the legendary designer Isabella Coleman. He designed a float with a queen of fantasy, and she was seated on a chair covered with roses. Coleman was paid $10,000 for this float, and it brought the city its 10th sweepstake and the most applause since the Peacock float of 1923. Coleman was back for a second year with his theme of California or Bust. That was in 1960 when California Governor and Mrs. Pat Brown and Vice President and Mrs. Richard Nixon viewed the parade. Nixon was the parade's Grand Marshal, and he posed for a picture with the Glendale float, which won the governor's trophy. The peacock theme reappeared in 1966, and that's the year that Coleman depicted a peacock throne, which was a delicate Persian design.
During much of the 60s decade, a common theme seemed to emerge as 1964's Pursuit of Happiness and 1965's Romance of the El Camino Real, followed by Romance of the Ranchos in 1967 and 1968's Cotillion, all portrayed young love in one form or another.
Originally, no human riders, just animated puppets, were planned for the 1971 float, Punch and Judy. However, when the big day arrived, Miss Glendale and two others were riding the float, and they were dressed as children enjoying a puppet show. The float won the Grand Marshal's trophy. 1972's float, still designed by Coleman, won the sweepstakes for Winter Wonderland. It featured a horse-drawn sleigh crossing a snow-covered bridge.
The first year I was involved with the Glendale Rose Float was 1974. My actual experience working with floats goes back to when I was going to Cal Poly Pomona. Starting out as an intern, I actually worked with Glendale Beautiful and with the Parks and Recreation Commission, just kind of coming up with the theme and design. At that time, it was highly driven by the city, by staff, and by the Parks and Recreation Commission because we didn't have a separate float association.
By 1976, the city had a newly formed Glendale Tournament of Roses Committee, which spearheaded a drive to raise funds for the float. This being America's bicentennial year, the parade's theme was America, Let's Show Our Colors, featuring a statue of an early American patriot carrying a 13-star flag.
Glendale's Peacock returned for the third time in 1977 with the theme Love is Beautiful. The design team of Heron and Preston submitted several ideas that year, and the final decision was left to the City Council. They selected the Peacock theme as being a reliable winner. It was decorated by 150 Hoover High students, and they finished the job at 6 p.m., just 15 minutes before judging. But it brought in another sweepstakes. And with this, Glendale had more sweepstakes for a non-commercial float than any other city.
California's Prop 13 put a major crimp in Rose Float funds, and for a while it was thought that Glendale's floats may have to be shelved.
Prior to 1978, it was all the City of Glendale. The governmental agency was responsible, including money in their budget, for providing for the float. But then in 1978, we had Proposition 13 pass, and the City Council, faced with some difficult budget decisions, decided to cut the funding for the float. And a lady by the name of Marlene Hamilton rose to the occasion. She was a local banker here in town, an active individual in our community. And she single-handedly raised $15,000 to put Glendale's float back on the parade route. And the Glendale Rose Float Committee was created by the Glendale Parks and Recreation Commission. And they were charged with the responsibility of promoting the float and raising funds for the float.
Back in the late 70s, early 80s, we changed our name from the Glendale Rose Float Committee to the Glendale Rose Float Association.
Business organizations and community fundraising came through every year, and by 1981 had produced Sunset on the Nile, which won the Grand Marshal's Trophy for a non-commercial design. And about this same time, a partnership between the city and the design firm of C.E. Bent, now Phoenix Decorating, was formed.
I can remember being a little kid and my father being involved with the City of Glendale probably 35, 40 years ago with other companies. Phoenix Decorating, since its inception in the early 80s, has built the Glendale float.
Today, Phoenix is still the designer-builder for Glendale's entries to the Tournament of Roses.
There's probably one float in Glendale's history that in particular got a lot of national, international, local community attention. And this float was called the Arrival of Rebecca. It got its attention, unfortunately, for probably all of the wrong reason.
It was depicting the Old Testament story of Rebecca going to meet her husband-to-be, Isaac. And there was Rebecca in this center lounge of the float, along with her handmaidens and other people. Had a canopy over the top of it, and it was beautifully decorated and multicolored. And then it had these long rods on either side of that lounge. And we had 32 so-called slaves who were propelling Rebecca down the parade route. Now, it appeared as if they were actually carrying Rebecca, but they weren't. The actual center console had wheels on it, and they were actually pushing it down the parade route, which made it a challenge.
It's a very beautiful, very ornate float carrying the legendary Rebecca was being carried by young men that were dressed in toga type of outfits.
And it was a great hit on the parade route, except for when it got to a certain point, some of the young ladies in the crowd began to yell out and encourage our young men. And at a certain point in the parade, they decided, some of them, to turn their backs to the crowd and flip up their togas.
Unfortunately, better judgment didn't prevail, and sure enough, a good number of them actually lifted their togas and mooned the audience.
They had white garments on underneath their togas. But it created a huge furor in the tournament.
Later, a news story said that this float was definitely a crowd pleaser. Fortunately, judging was done before the parade, and it brought Glendale the Grand Marshal Trophy.
Cashing in on the pin mania that swept the country after the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, the Glendale Rose Float Committee created its own design the next year, which became a hot-ticket item and helped with fundraising. This tradition is still observed today, and many individuals prize their extensive collections.
It was the Tournament of Roses Association who started that, and they saw it as another opportunity to promote the parade. And pin collection was pretty significant at that time. And in '85, the tournament initiated pins for the Tournament of Roses parade, which was the Happy Birthday Donald Duck float. To the 2010 float, I have got all of those float pins as a part of my collection, and I intend to collect them as long as I can.
The Walt Disney Company honored the City of Glendale in 1985 by allowing its image of Donald Duck to be used on a float. This was the first time a Disney character was authorized for use in a Rose Parade entry. In 1987, Carvel Gay, who was the new head of the float committee, called on businesses to help fund that year's float. A design called Jewel of the Nile was selected.
That was going back to the 80th year, and that was sort of celebrating our birthday. It was a large float. It was a 65-foot float, and it was very high, and it was automated. And about this time, automation was just really coming in. More expensive for the automation. That was something that we had to talk about because it meant more money. And not only would the city have to come up with more money, but the committee would have to make more money and do more fundraising. It was all fundraising, and we had a lot of fundraisers, let me tell you.
By the middle of 1990, membership on the committee had grown to 400, and Ruth Dodson, the new president, invited everyone to a fundraiser in Shoal Park. The float Winter Wonderland cost $90,000, with the fundraising bringing in half of that amount.
In 1990, we had a float that was called Winter Wonderland. And in that particular float, I was the steerer on that float. I was steering the float. And Bob McFall was the spotter, but he also was responsible for braking the float. And we were going down the parade route. We were just headed down Orange Grove at the beginning of the parade, and we were making the right turn onto Colorado.
And it was a design that had these very, very large wheels on it, and it just steered poorly.
Well, that's a real wide turn. And that float, as I recall, was a 55-foot float, so it was one of the longer floats that we had. And we always rely on the white suiters, the Tournament of Roses Association staff or volunteers who guide us and tell us, start making your turn. Well, we did exactly that. We followed the advice of the white suitor. Well, unfortunately, he had us make the turn too wide.
As I am peering through my peephole to see how to make the turn, and as I'm also listening on the TV, because I always brought in a portable TV, I can hear the announcer starting to say, "Folks, it looks like the Glendale float's going to hit the grandstand."
And Bob was screaming at me, "Nello, turn right," and I'm just turning the wheel as far as it can go. And we got closer and closer to the grandstands on the corner of Orange Grove and Colorado.
All of a sudden, people start jumping out of the grandstand, and they're moving away from where this 15-ton monster is approaching them.
And we actually clipped, the front of the float clipped the grandstands. And as I understand, I didn't see it, but the crowd went scattering as we clipped the grandstands. And after the parade, I remember Bob saying, "Nello, I'm never going to listen to a white suitor again."
In 1992, Glendale's float was called World Traveler.
It was really a very beautiful float. It was a dirigible, and it was all about world travel. For me, this was a float where I actually, in this case, the spotter, got to be outside of the float. And for every driver and for every spotter, you really kind of do look forward to an opportunity where, for once, you can actually be out with the crowd and see what their faces are showing, and just be a part of it from a different perspective. And on that particular float, I was the driver of the dirigible as far as the design of the float, so it was sitting on top and in front with a dirigible tiller, but I also had a headset on and was directing the operator inside on where to go, how to go with the float.
Walt Disney Imagineering joined with the city in 1993 to bring the float Fantasia to life.
Fantasia was my favorite float. It was a Disney-themed float. It was intended to around the animated movie Fantasia that Disney put out. And it was Mickey Mouse dressed as the Sorcerer's Apprentice with a wand, as I recall. But the design of the float, the color of the float was just fantastic. But I think what made it my favorite float was that Disney wanted to make sure that their product met their criteria exactly. So that meant that the design of the float, the color of the float, the proportion of the float, everything had to be exact. And what they did was they assigned one of the original animators to Fantasia to the design of our float. And he would come out periodically to the float barn and he would check the float just to make sure that everything was exactly to the criteria of Disney. It was, to me, the most impeccable float that we ever had.
Mother Goose Stories in 1996 featured then Glendale Mayor Rick Reyes dressed as a fairy tale favorite, Old King Cole. And this was the start of a new trend for Glendale. For the first time, volunteers decorated the entire float with no assistance from the float builder.
My most memorable float experience was back in 1997 for our Best Friends float. And every year the Glendale Rose Float Association Board produces pins which are a mini depiction of the float. That year it happened to be a depiction of Raggedy Ann and Andy. And I got a phone call from a sweet mom who had called and said that she had 2 children, both suffering from cerebral palsy, who loved Raggedy Ann and Andy and was asking if I could get a couple pins to her. So I obtained the pins and mailed them off and really didn't think too much about it. And months later, I got a very nice letter from her indicating her thanks and how enjoyable her children found the pins to be. She also sent photos of her children dressed as Raggedy Ann and Andy wearing the pins. And I still have that letter and the photos today. It really meant a lot.
A float that received worldwide attention arrived just in time for the millennium. It featured a 23-foot tall basset hound, and the basset hound was dressed for a night on the town.
The original name of the float was Party Animal, and there were a number of, as I recall, actual members of the Rose Float Association who opposed that theme of Party Animal. They didn't feel that Party Animal was the right image that we wanted to depict for the community of Glendale.
Someone didn't like the float, so they said it put Glendale in a bad light because it was a dog with a party hat and streamers, and they thought it made it look like this dopey-looking dog was drunk. I went before the city council, and I said, nowhere on this float do you see drugs or alcohol or anything. He doesn't know if his collar is going to be installed at the new year, turn of the century, and he doesn't know if his computer is going to work. And I suggested that if the city council would pick this float, that they ought to name it after those naysayers and call it the Pompous Pooch.
Ultimately, the city council didn't like the theme, and we were directed to go back and to come back with a number of other theme ideas. And ultimately, the theme that was selection was having fun yet. Frankly, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I thought Party Animal was a great theme for the parade.
It made the national headlines. The Basset Hound group, rescue group, got involved with us.
We're holding the event today to raise funds for our float, which is the Basset Hound for year 2000. The money that we derive from here will also go into a fund for the following year's float.
We had wine that we're selling with a dog on it. We were selling mugs. We had T-shirts with a dog on it. We had T-shirts with a big circle and a line out because people didn't like it. And we sold more shirts, more pins, more paraphernalia and collectibles that year than any other year.
There was a lot of controversy in local newspapers, and I understand it did become a national issue. And obviously on the Jay Leno show, if he says, as a part of his comments or his monologue, that makes a joke out of it, it becomes even a bigger issue.
In 2000, the first Dreaming of Roses fundraiser took place at the new DreamWorks campus. The fundraiser featured dancing and food tasting and entertainment and a live auction, and brought in $30,000 to help pay for the next year's Hometown Slugger.
I became president of the Glendale Rose Float Association in 2001, and that was the float we had was the giant baseball player.
The 2004's fundraiser at the new KABC studios helped raise money for one-man band. Margaret Hammond, Glendale's hat lady, was one of the riders on the float.
We had the one-man band, thousands of red roses that almost touched the ceiling in here.
Imagination Express, the 2006 float, featured a train with a happy face on the engine. It was the first time in 51 years that it had rained on the parade. But despite the elements, the animated locomotive was awarded the Isabella Coleman Trophy. That was for Best Presentation of Color Harmony. It took 600 volunteers about 4,400 hours to decorate the 22-foot high, 35-foot long float.
I loved the bear, because I still remember when that was being towed back, it was creating a traffic jam on the 210 freeway, and there was the California bear leading the crowd. I loved that because it looked so real.
Two of Glendale's most favorite icons were featured in the years 2008 and 2009. Bon Voyage, depicting a biplane taking off from Grand Central's air terminal, won a mayor's trophy in 2009.
That was marvelous because we had a plane there. We created stucco and tile, made it look like a real building. That was fun.
The next year's sneak preview, which was a tribute to the Alex Theater, won the Past President's Award for Most Creative Use of Floral and Non-Floral Elements. It was the 51st major award for the city.
My overall favorite float in all the years I've been working with the Rose Parade was Sneak Preview, which was back in 2009. And that float was a depiction of the Alex Theater. And it was such a joy to be able to share such a wonderful facility with the rest of the world. We have such a historic jewel right here in our city, and it was nice to see it make its way down Colorado Boulevard.
So I guess my all-time favorite was the eagle that we did in 2010 because it was such a magnificent looking, it looked so real. And we found out months later that the three judges had said it was the most magnificent eagle they'd ever seen created in floral, and it didn't win. We were just devastated. To this day, I still get compliments on that eagle, and people still have the t-shirts and wear it around. People love the t-shirt with it on. I still have the head in my backyard.
I specifically happened to like last year's. It was an eagle. I like doing eagles. They're just fun to do. And the deck itself was just really done very well and very pretty, and I personally thought it should have won.
It had to do with American pride, and it was the one that we did honoring the soldiers, the military. And that was also done with representatives from all the branches of service. We had a flyover from the Air Force, and we had a lot of soldiers, a lot of troops that came to review the parade, and that was a great float.
So what goes into the making of these magnificent floral creations? We followed the making of the 2011 Glendale Rose Float entry, Say Cheese. It all begins with a budget and a concept for a design, based on complementing the Tournament of Roses theme. The 2011 parade theme was building dreams, friendships, and memories, and the float concept that was selected by the Glendale Rose Float Association depicted a large bellows camera with a special effects flash, many framed photos in which riders would recreate memories. To tie in with the Say Cheese theme, a mouse photographer stood atop the large camera with his own small camera. After the Glendale Rose Float Association votes on a design, it is then approved by both the Parks and Recreation Commission and the City Council. And then the skeleton of the float is built by Phoenix Decorating.
At the beginning of the year, we like to, in one of our meetings, we'll talk about fundraising.
We've had various events to raise funds for the Rose Float. We've had golf tournaments, casino nights, we had a tea party, we had a craft fair at the Verdugo Park.
Art auctions. We had a car show up at Stinglefield, which was a Concours d'Elegance. And these cars were over $100,000. These were real classics.
And then we had the Dreaming of Roses, which was highly successful, and that was started by our City Councilman Dave Weaver. One of our ways of earning money to give to the city is to auction off the riders on the float. This last year, our granddaughter turned 16, and we bought a ride for her to ride on the float. And it was the ride of her life.
And a lot of our Glendale citizens and people on the float committee have ridden on it and had members of their families ride on it, and that's a good source of money. The one year my granddaughter, Ashley, had ridden on, and that was tea at Grandma's house, and she just loved it.
The one aspect of the fundraising that I might try to spend more time on is getting a greater segment of the community involved with it.
The Glendale Rose Float is one of the few organizations, if not the only one, that donates money back to the city for the efforts that we are doing.
In the early years of the parade, it was primarily cities who participated in the parade. And then in the 80s, it began to change, and large corporations began to become a part of the parade. And so you had these large corporations that were coming up with large amounts of funds, upwards of $250,000 to fund floats. For the city floats, they rely on their communities and on their local government agency to assist them with the funding of their floats.
We select the float in around March, sometime in March, because they have to present it to the tournament for approval.
It is Phoenix Decorating's responsibility to get the float done for the parade. We have staff here that is in charge of the decoration aspects of it. We certainly encourage the communities to bring people in, like the City of Glendale. They bring a lot of folks in from the City of Glendale, and the float gives them really something to rally around. It's really a community project. There's a lot to the process of building a float, and as you can see around the room here, it all starts out as a piece of artwork. We are a steel shop, for the most part.
A lot of time is spent on the engineering of the float, the undercarriage, the mechanics, the technology going behind it. In particular, as more and more hydraulics have become prevalent in floats.
Animation is the most expensive, the most costly thing that I do. The difference between sculpting an art form that doesn't move and then sculpting an art form and then putting a mechanism that does move is the difference between driving down the street and going to the moon.
They have all these grids on the floor, 1 foot grids, and they lay that down and they bend the pencil wire to fit that, and they have sculptors for the styrofoam. And it takes about 2 months to get it into that condition.
And there literally are skilled artisans that with a knife, just as if they were sculpting stone or through some other means, will sculpt a head or a figure. So the outside of the floats become very sophisticated in their design. The actual technology and the construction of the floats have become quite more sophisticated.
Glendale is we've done a couple of things. For proportion purposes, we have done an overheight mechanism, and we have done a special effect in the flash of the mouse that's actually taking the pictures at the top. So we're having a little fun with it.
They put screening on it and foam, so it's kind of a finished float, but it's still a white float at this point. And then they paint it the colors that it's going to be decorated. It's kind of like decorate by numbers, like you do paint by numbers. We are one of the smallest floats in the parade at 35 feet, and our float currently costs around $95,000. And it's a little cheaper because we self-decorate it also. After it's built and tested, they test it to see about its drivability. They have to have various testing for mechanical, which goes through the tournament.
The tournament actually has a number of rules regulating the floats. Every float has to have at least 2 people. One is a spotter, a person who has at least some field of vision to be able to see where the float is going. And then there is the driver, the person who normally has the steering wheel, the brakes, the gas pedal, controls the motor. What the spotter does is literally guide the driver, who is normally blind. If you can imagine, these 15-ton, 50-foot-long floats are being driven by people who can see nothing more than the road going below them.
Safety has become sort of the number one issue. It's not only safety, unfortunately, it's liability in these days. Safety is paramount. We send the floats through a very rigorous tests and timing with drivers on board. We do fire drills so that in case of an emergency, that make sure everybody can get off in time.
If you look at some of the earlier floats from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, you'll see floats that primarily had not very sophisticated in terms of their designs. A lot of greenery was involved rather than a lot of color. And then in the 50s, the 60s, particularly in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, the changes really began to happen. You began to see much more sophisticated design of floats. You began to see a lot more exotic and colorful flowers being added to the floats. You saw a lot of sophisticated dry materials, beans, rices, those types of things being added to the floats.
The sophisticated float decorating of today is overseen by Phoenix Decorating's floral director, who instructs the volunteer crew chief on how the float should be decorated. The crew chief oversees the assistant crew chief and the experienced volunteers known as white jackets, as well as the newer, less experienced volunteers in the overall decorating throughout December.
As a floral director, my job is to make sure all the floats are covered with either dry materials or fresh flowers, all the decoration side of all our floats. My job actually starts around April. I do my first ordering for flowers in May. I have places around the world that have to start their crops that are growing specifically for us. And if it's out of the U.S., they'll stop it because it needs to either be fumigated or customs will check it out. So I have to make sure it's all going to make it through in time for that 1 week.
And then it's stored until, around Thanksgiving when we start decorating it.
I break it down, I measure everything, I figure out how much I'm going to put on each float, whether it's dry or fresh. I make a book for each float. It breaks down everything. It's pretty much paint by number kind of book. It starts at the beginning. They got everything on that float is in that book. It tells them how to decorate it, where to put it, what kind of glue to use, because we use 3 different kinds of glues. And sometimes they have to do some special things like blend some materials together. I also go through a walkthrough with each one of my crew chief and assistant crew chief, and they're the people that are in charge of each individual float. And then they explain it to each one of the volunteers that is working in different areas on their floats.
Well, I think I've been a crew chief about 6, 7 years out of the total 18 I've done it. In all honesty, what you do is oversee the construction, the decoration of the float through the month of December. You see the patterns, what has to be done, when it has to be done. You try to do joint things all at the same time to save time. You tell the kids what area to work on. You teach them. Here's the book, here's what you're going to apply and where, because there's hundreds of materials that go on.
This is my 14th year. I started many years ago as just a simple decorator. Got promoted to detail work when it was seen that I have that talent. Many years of putting things on with individual items at a time, and then promoted to what they call the white jackets, and then subsequently promoted when the vacuum was there and sucked me in for assistant crew chief.
We start putting on the seed material, what we call the dry material, the first weekend in December.
All of the dry material is put on with a white glue, which is water soluble. So it would, if it gets enough water on it, it will just dissolve and run. A few years ago, the little engine that we had, you can see kind of tears coming out below the eyes because of the dark materials running into the lighter materials as the rain washed it.
As a volunteer, we just show up and we do whatever is required, what we need to do to decorate the float, and we follow the crew chief's instructions. And working for a few years, I have gained the experience to be able to do any part of the float on my own, and then it's more of learning on the job.
On December 26th, that's our first official decoration week, even though we've had 3 dry deck days in December ahead of that. We continue doing our dry decoration, which is seeds, beans, paper bark, palm fiber, palm bark. We continue doing that all day on the 26th. On the 27th, we're still doing that because there's still a lot of detail work, because a lot of stuff goes on one at a time.
I think the most difficult seed to work with is lentil. It's one of the smaller ones that we put on individually, and it can be tedious to get it in the right place and have them touch each other, which is the rule of the decoration.
It's very time consuming, and then there's a lot of prep work on those 2 days of cutting things that are like status, which is behind me, and that's all cut very fine, and then we put those in blenders to make it a little finer.
Our first week here in 2011, we had 160 students cutting the first day.
By the first part of the 28th, if the weather is nice and cool, we sometimes can start on mums up high. If not, we wait till the end of the day on the 28th, because we always have to work from up above, getting down, because we have scaffolding to concern ourselves, because that has to come down long before our final judging.
Then we start to put on the live material, the flowers, the gerbers, all the live flora that people are used to the afternoon of the 29th, and we do it on the 30th.
There's over 10,000 tubed flowers alone on the deck of City of Glendale float this year.
This year, for the flowers of the float, we have a grand total of 8,900 that we're putting on ourselves.
The predominant colors on City of Glendale's float this year are red roses. They go around the big camera, but there are some Christmas red mums, white mums around the deck, and then I have orange roses, red roses, and gerbs and carnations. And then on the back where the cake is, I have elfin pink mum to make it look like frosting, and white mum there, and then some everlasting, which is sparkly flower, to give that little sparkle on a cake frosting.
We have a red stripe and a white stripe on the bottom of the float, and they're all mums. And we have a certain allotment given to us to decorate all of that, and the challenge is figuring out how many mums we actually need to cover the entire portion and not run out before the whole float is decorated.
The mouse on City of Glendale that has a little camera. He's going to have uva grass on his body to make him look a little furry, and he's got some clothes on, so those are going to be some carnation petals. He's also going to have some ground orange lentil, and then he has little shoes, and we're going to cover those with palm bark, so he looks like he has little leather shoes on.
The orange material is ground lentil. It starts off as a seed that's maybe 3/16 of an inch diameter. The Phoenix company grinds it, and we put it through a sieve to get everything approximately the same size. And then we apply it to the float with white glue.
Oh, silverleaf is the worst of the live flowers, and it's on our flash material this year. You'll see it up on the flash camera. That's all silverleaf.
On the camera on City of Glendale is seaweed, and there's silverleaf, which is a shiny thing, give it a little glimmer. Then on the lens itself, we'll have linaria. We use that a lot for glass look. The way we keep our flowers fresh on the floats is several ways. We have vials that have water in them, and they're about this tall, and the largest one get a little bit taller. And they're fresh cuts of the flowers, so when they go in, they got one more freshness to them, so they'll drink the water. But once they go on a float, they're still in the vials, and then if we have warm days, we start spritzing them with water bottles.
Each year we have, on the average, about 600 volunteers, primarily teenagers. When I first started, we had, well, that was 18, 19 years ago, we'd have 10 or 15 from the city, hardly any students. So I came up with the idea of going to all the schools and getting community service hours for the students.
When I was in 8th grade, I was a student at Rosemont Middle School, and they announced that they were looking for volunteers for the Glendale Rose Float. And I thought it would be interesting because I watch the parade every year, so I thought it would be fun to be a part of the floats, the same ones that I see on TV. I think this experience will teach me life lessons that I can use later, because this was pretty much my first real job, but I think it's a good experience to learn to manage other people and to take advice from others and criticism, and I learned all of that here.
Initially, when I was in high school as a freshman, I did it for the community service hours for the graduation requirement. But then after the first year, it was actually very fun, and I didn't expect it to be. I just kept coming back, even though I wasn't getting any hours, because it actually is a lot of fun to work on a float and to be able to be so creative.
The first 5 years, I earned community service hours for school, but now I'm not in high school anymore, so I don't get any hours. I just do it for fun.
The Rose Float Association is nonprofit. All the schools cooperate, and so the students come and get their 10 hours. And then when they do, I always end up with 4 or 5 that will come back every year up through high school. I have students on here now that started in 8th grade. They've gone through high school, gone through college, working for a living, and they're still working on the float. And they're called white jackets for the most part.
If you show up enough hours and come enough years, then you're offered a white jacket, which kind of gives you authority to lead people and answer any questions if people need help, or assign jobs if people don't know what to do.
I earned my jacket actually about 5 years of decorating, and I believe that this jacket signifies how much experience I've gained over the years, and it has given me responsibilities to train new volunteers so that they can decorate the float properly.
For me as an engineer who worked on projects that took 20 years, you see something built in a month from start to finish. It's just a beautiful creation. And I think that's what primarily what the girls and the guys that come back every year feel. They see a creation and I give them a lot of flexibility to work and be creative. You can't get it anywhere else. So we'll enjoy that. And we come back every year, it's like reunion. We come back together again, and every year there's some new ones that join that crowd.
Every year there is an exotic material that we have to use, and that creates a challenge for us in figuring out how to put it on so that it looks good. And I think that challenge is my favorite part.
The normal sequence of events is on the day before New Year's, in the afternoon sometime, the judges are going around and doing the final judging. And there's a tremendous amount of anxiety. The judges, they are very thorough people. They have a checklist of things that they have to go through, and they're also very tight-lipped about what they're thinking about anybody's floats.
If you look at the float behind me today, we're sitting here on the 30th of December. The float has to be done today. The judging has been moved up from 1:30 on the 31st to 7:30 a.m. on the 31st. Therefore, we've been told we have to have the entire float done, in essence, almost a day earlier than we've ever done before.
There's a distinction that needs to be made between self-built floats and floats that are self-decorated. You have some floats that are built by, as an example, the students at Cal Poly. They would build their own float and they would decorate their own float. So they were self-built and self-decorated. Then you have another category that is, you have the float built by a contractor, a float builder, but then decorated, self-decorated by the community. An example of that is Glendale.
The three judges come in with tournament guests or escorts. They have 5 minutes on each float. We always wonder as workers what the judges are looking for, and we haven't the foggiest.
So following the judging then would begin the procession of all of the floats moving out of the buildings, what's referred to as the move out. And now this is where you have to move it from wherever it's being built and or decorated into a line on Orange Grove. And you have to be in line by 2 o'clock in the morning on Orange Grove, or your float is disqualified from participating in the parade.
We would also then just guard it and stay with it overnight. The float drivers, which were typically city staff, part of our staff who were escorting the float, would make sure that they were all set up to drive the float or to spot for the float as we were taking it down the parade route.
In the meantime, trying to stay warm because it's so very cold in the middle of the night.
And then at about 3 o'clock in the morning, what would happen would be the judges would come by for their final judging. And they come by with a truck with huge floodlights that would light up every single float on Orange Grove.
Normally my days start about 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when we have our riders meet at City Hall, and they do need to be on the parade route no later than 6 in the morning.
Then the float riders would show up, we'd load them onto the floats, and they would go ahead and take off down Orange Grove heading for Colorado for the parade.
A big announcement goes out throughout all the floats to start the bunch up. And that's usually around 6 or 6:30 or so. You got to get the float started, you get all the equipment cleared away, and now you're moving up into the starting position onto Orange Grove, getting ready to begin the parade.
I usually go to the parade every past year I have.
The sense of accomplishment you have and realizing that something that you have contributed to is going down the parade route in front of probably a few million people and being seen around the world by many million more.
We decided a long time ago to build a good product, to take a lot of pride in our floats, to put the heart and the emotion into the floats, and the banners come.
The Boy Scouts, who are normally the carriers of the awards, walk out in front of you with a banner. And that's when you find out if you've actually won an award. The banner comes out in front of you.
The grander awards, the Sweepstakes Award as an example, or the Extraordinary Award, primarily went to corporations, and I think still does.
When you're driving the float, there is one key maneuver that is extremely important to do properly, and that's the turn from Orange Grove onto Colorado. The first rule is you don't want to break down because you're on TV. at any cost you will make that turn. The second is, despite what the white suitors are directing you on the outside, that is your moment when you're on international television and you want to get as much airtime as possible. So that's what our objective always is. Maximize the airtime, get through the turn smoothly, and don't break down. If you got an award, then you proceed to the Orange Grove turn. You do the few miles down Colorado Boulevard. You go over to Victory Park, park the float.
Viewing of the floats after the parade is usually about 2 days.
I do go to the parade viewing after the parade, just to see all the floats up close.
There's this tradition of bringing the Glendale float back to Glendale and parking it in front of the Alex Theater.
The citizens, the people who have paid for it, actually have a week or so where they can come up and get a close view of the float.
We wanted to bring our float home from Pasadena to Glendale.
By this time, the floats really aren't drivable anymore. So Carville always very generously agreed that he would tow the float back. This style of float is very unique to the Tournament of Roses. These are real artisans, and they're doing this knowing fully that within a few days it will be torn apart.
We take out the vials because we save them every year.
After the flowers are taken off, the foam all gets pulled off, gets recycled. All of my bins, that even our trash all goes through a recycling plant. The steel gets separated and recycled and scrapped.
We have such a wonderful opportunity in bringing our community together and working on our annual float. And I really encourage the young people of Glendale to get involved and be part of that process. It will give them a great opportunity to work with others and also give them a sense of pride in their work and the accomplishment of being able to see the float on Colorado Boulevard. We also welcome any youth and any adult to help us with the float every year. And if they are interested, they can certainly visit our webpage.
To sign up to work on the float next year, and I'm always looking for new volunteers, you can go to our website and sign up online. Every year, though, we do notify the schools because the freshmen coming in wouldn't know about online, so we get forms and communication to each school. This year already, we've had about 10 different schools, all the Glendale schools, all the surrounding area come, and of course we get some that come from out of town. We have a lady here working today from Mexico, and one from France came in, and when they do, they come and ask me, can they work on your float? I said, sure. It's really great to see all the diversity we get.
But I would like to have people get a little more interested in the float. I'd like to see the city fathers come out. It's just a great experience for anybody.
There needs to be a lot more people involved with the float in terms of its fundraising, in terms of its selection.
And I encourage any students, particularly ones that are artistic-minded and like detail work, to consider signing up and working on the float. It's a great privilege, and I'll see how many more years my body will take me down the road to do this.
I think trying to generate more participation in the float is critical.
I would encourage anybody to brave the cold and the busyness of the holiday season and go over to the Float Palace and to volunteer for doing decorating, be a tour guide, do something to be associated with it. Bring your family over and your relatives over. They'll get to see something and be a part of something that most people simply can't.